Very interesting article in the National Interest today talking about what is essentially the new Cold War with China that Mike Pompeo, in particular, the U.S. Secretary of State, is pushing right now. And, things already with this administration, Trump kind of ran as someone who was more skeptical and critical of China than past presidents, thought that the U.S. was much too close to China, thought that there was way too much trade with China, too much interdependence of our economies. And as I've been discussing, this whole pandemic situation has really been a great opportunity for this administration to ramp up that sort of sentiment and to justify it and to take a victory lap and say, this is a terrible tragedy, but see, we told you so. And Mike Pompeo has really been the mouthpiece of that. Now, Mike Pompeo, being a former CIA director, probably is not very happy with China anyway. He seems to be much more in the realm of the sort of anti-China versus anti-Russia hawks in Washington. People tend to lean one way or the other about which one they're more concerned about. Now, while I think that both of them are, dangerous and not great to have around, I don't really like either form of hawks. At least the anti-China hawks make a little more sense, since China is a big, legitimate threat. They're a very scary, not nice government that nobody would want to live under, and they do have a very powerful military. They have nukes, and they are somebody who could, if they wanted to, conquer, every country around them. Russia, on the other hand, is weak and feeble and, has an economy the size of Italy, as people, often like to point out. So Russia, not really a threat to anybody. But with that said, well, even while I acknowledge that, China certainly is, if you want to look at any country in the world, is much more threatening to, I guess well, you know what? Threatening is not even really the right word, because China hasn't really threatened anyone except for their immediate neighbors. China's been very territorial in wanting to expand their influence, but they're not doing anything like threatening to overthrow Western governments or anything like that. Which is why I don't think that the Hawks approach is really a correct one. You really want to mitigate something like China. Recognize that they're not great people. You don't want to talk to them as if they are, France or Germany. It's very clear that they're not France or Germany. I'm not a big fan of those countries. I wouldn't want to live there, but I can at least recognize that for the most part, people there are free to criticize the government, even though freedom of speech is not something that really exists outside of the United States. China, on the other hand, is very brutal towards dissidents, and of course is, ruled by a single party. And this really is what Pompeo has been hammering home about. This is what he's trying to say is really makes China's differences with the West irreconcilable, because China, since 1949, actually before 1949 too, has been it's a tyrannical, despotic state. To where the people there do not have the freedom to choose their own government, which in my opinion, it doesn't make China bad in and of itself. If you have a dictator who doesn't really do anything, just sort of sits around and drinks cognac all day, unintentional reference to Kim Jong-il, then things aren't so bad. If your dictator's not oppressing you, it doesn't really matter whether you get to vote for him or not. And the same thing is true if 51% of the people vote for some candidate who oppresses the other 49% of people. Well, then those 49% of people, it doesn't make their lives any better that they're being oppressed by someone who was elected. But it is a fact. It's not a fact. These things are subjective, but in my opinion, it's not unreasonable to say that the Chinese Communist Party is pretty tyrannical. But with that said, tyrants and the United States have a tendency to get along just fine so long as they're in a subordinate relationship, such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a very oppressive country for its people. It's not so great to dissidents. It's not so great to women who want to drive. But the U.S. does very well in dealing with Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is beneath the U.S. And the U.S. in certain ways acknowledges these other Western nations like the UK and France as on somewhat equal terms, even though it's very clear that the U.S. is in the superior relationship there. And even though China, it's clear they on a sort of a global power from a global power standpoint are in second place behind the United States. They are the most comparable to the United States in terms of power. Pompeo is saying that they cannot be treated as our equals. And he's hinting at that President Trump is going to be moving to expand on this vision and to implement things that sort of are informed by this kind of an idea that we can't just treat China like another country. And I have to say I'm quite intrigued to see what those are. I do think that if you try and have a second Cold War here, it would be very different from the first and much more hard to navigate because China is so interconnected with the Western economies. We have a globalized economic system at this point. We didn't have that in 1945 when the old Cold War began, and there wasn't this great interdependence in the Soviet and American economies. But now, we do have that constant trade back and forth between the U.S. and China, mostly things coming from China to the U.S. And so if the U.S. entered this new Cold War phase, well, how do you replace all that commerce? Where does it come from? Who do you have make all this stuff? India? Well, it takes time to build all the factories that exist in China in India or some other country, and to try and make all of the same products as well as they were made in China. So then what's your choice? Move production back to the United States or some other Western nations? Well, good luck with that, because labor costs are so high here that the cost of production would surge, supply would crater, the cost of living would surge, and the standard of living would plummet. People would just simply have to do the same with less. Products would become more scarce. And I don't think that, consumerism is necessarily a good thing. I think that most people buy a lot of, spend much of their income throughout their entire lives buying junk that they don't need, which happens to be made in China. But it would be a major shift in our society, and something that you can't just do on a dime. You can't just snap your fingers and detach the United States from China. It's been, many decades, half a century, just about half a century, the early 70s, when China started to open up. Let's say 40 years when, trade really started to kick off in the 80s between the U.S. and China. It's taken a long time to get to where we are now, and so it will take, at least that long to unwind all of that. And so how are you going to do that? Because if the Chinese know that your goal is to, unwind trade with them and just sort of start this new Cold War, well, they're not just going to let you do that so that it's painless. The Chinese are going to try and make that as painful for you as possible. So what is the plan here that this government has? How are you going to be combative and start some Cold War with China without immediate consequences to American consumers? Because again, you can post all the consumer memes that you want and make fun of people. I do that, from time to time. But you have to acknowledge that people are not just going to take that lying down. If they feel like that their standard of living has declined because of Trump, well, Trump or whoever the president is that's carrying out this policy is going to face political backlash. And if that isn't enough, this society will be torn apart, because as I've stated many times, what holds America together is consumption. We are a nation of consumers. That's all that Americans have in common. There is no real, American society. It's, America is way too big and populous and diverse to have any real center. And so without all these creature comforts to lull people into accepting the status quo, well then folks, may just start to rise up and demand, something new, something that may enhance their standard of living. But China, is, looking at the other side of the equation, is a very similar society. China, frankly, doesn't even speak the same language across their entire country. And I'm not talking about, some people are native Spanish speakers like in the United States and they have to learn English. No, in China, it's almost like Europe. with how many different societies there are within, the state known as China. And so they too are held together by the idea that, the Chinese Communist Party, sure, we don't have control over them, but as long as they do the right thing, and they make it so that, we're always gaining money, and so that we are increasing our standard of living, so that life is getting better, we're willing to accept, their tyrannical rule. We will go along to get along, so long as there's something in it for us. But if trade between China and the United States encounters a rough patch because of this Cold War, well, that's going to hurt a lot of Chinese producers. They're going to have to find new markets to sell their wares. And so that too will lead to, some instability within China, because people will start to question, well, if the reason why we accept the Chinese Communist Party is that we want prosperity, but now the reason why we are losing prosperity, why our standard of living is decreasing, why we can't find jobs, is because the United States is mad at the Chinese Communist Party. Well, then maybe we need to get rid of them and replace them with someone else, who will be more conducive to promoting international trade. And so it's a real gamble here who will break first, the U.S. or the Chinese in this case. And frankly, I don't know which, but a full-blown Cold War 2.0 with China would be painful for both sides, very painful. I mean, if you thought the Wu flu pandemic so far was bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. If we enter a depression because of this Wu flu, and then on top of it start, restricting trade with China, let's say that even we reduce 20% over the next 3 years or so, that would have a very significant impact on folks who already are making less money and can afford less. If the cost of living keeps rising, and if there's more and more scarcity at a time when people are making less money, we're going to see unrest in this country that will make the 1960s look very tame. So I think that about sums up my thoughts on what Pompeo said. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see folks back here tomorrow.